Ann Garrels lets us feel, helps us to understand what was going on in Baghdad. When NBC, CBS, and ABC had left Baghdad, when CNN had gone, the remarkable Ann Garrels was there, placing us there and helping us to find the truth. Now she has enriched that enormous gift of reporting she gave to us with her marvelous new book, Naked in Baghdad, which she'll be signing in our bookstore after this forum. In writing so clear and evocative that you can hear her voice, Ann weaves together a diary of the time leading up to the U.S. bombing and throughout the war. Interspersed throughout are the emails her husband, Vint Lawrence, wrote to friends to update them on Ann's whereabouts, affectionately referring to her as Brenda, as in the comic book heroine Brenda Starr, Star Reporter. Through his eyes, Vint's eyes, we see a whole new Ann, as when Vint writes of Ann's life in Baghdad, quote, "To while away the downtime of the cat and mouse game that is so much of her life these days, Brenda has taken up a new indoor sport, embroidery. Madame Dufarge incarnate, Brenda stitches away, artfully recording the elusive sights of weapons of mass destruction on pillowcases collected from the better hotels en route." Prior to her embroidery career, Ann Garrels covered the Soviet Union, Central America, and the State Department for ABC and NBC News. She moved to NPR in 1988 and has reported from around the world, including Afghanistan, Israel, Pakistan, Bosnia, and the former Soviet republics. Reporting does not get better than hers and gutsier than hers, as recognized by her winning the DuPont Award and the Overseas Press Award. And we are especially pleased that the moderator of today's forum also has graced us with top-notch reporting from Baghdad and around the world. Dick Gordon is host of WBUR's The Connection and joined WBUR after years as a leading correspondent for the CBC. Dick, I turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. Nice to have you here. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's nice to see the room so full, though. It didn't surprise me at all knowing who our guest was going to be tonight. Is it still disconcerting for you to listen to a piece of tape like that, to hear the tone of your voice, to know what was going through your mind when you did it?
And especially that day,
yeah.
Because we never, there was no clarity. You only had people's perceptions of, the clarity was people had been killed by an explosion. What caused the explosion? Was it indeed an American bomb? We did not know that day. It was what Iraqis believed to be the case. I believe, actually now, I've been back to that neighborhood, and there were two instances like this where there were numerous civilian casualties, where there were large blasts in civilian neighborhoods, which was frankly unusual. The American bombing, for the most part, was highly accurate, and Iraqis knew it, and they knew more or less what the targets were, and they were military installations, security installations, Saddam's palaces. And there were, in fact, very few civilian neighborhoods that were hit. And when they were hit, the question was, what were they hit with? I describe a crater, and it was only, about 5 feet round and not very deep. It was not, in fact, a typical, it did not have the signature of an American bomb. Subsequently, I think it became clear that, or clearer, that it may well have been an Iraqi missile that went awry.
I wonder if you know now how many of us woke up each morning in March and April listening for Carl Castles to say, not in this news from Iraq, but with a report, here's Ann Garrels, just so we would know that you were still in one piece. Were you aware of that at the time? Any idea?
I got a hint of it only well in when I was trying to beg off being on the air, and I said to Lauren Jenkins, my foreign editor, I don't have anything to say. And Lauren said, I don't care. If you don't go on the air, they'll think you're dead. And I'll have to deal with a lot of emails. So, at that point, I got an inkling, but I frankly was living in a cocoon. I was just I didn't speak at length with the shows or with the foreign editor because the satellite phone that I was using, I would knock it and put it up, broadcast quickly, and then knock it down as fast as I could so the antenna wasn't visible out the window. I didn't want it to be confiscated. So there weren't long, lengthy, and also the sat phone's very expensive at $8 a minute. So we didn't have long, lengthy discussions. And it was really only when I got back and I saw emails from listeners, and it was overwhelming. I mean, and people sent me unguents and oils, and well beyond. I mean, it really made me then I got a glimpse. Although it was also a little scary to be, suddenly one of the 16, who had stayed, whatever. And you get there right afterwards.
Yeah.
You got in there very quickly, I have to say, one of the first, and saw the disgusting room I lived in.
I'm probably one of the few NPR people who met you first in a hotel in Baghdad.
That's right.
I'd actually called up from the lobby and said, Ann, it's Dick Gordon from WBUR Boston. She said, I am terribly, terribly busy. And I said, Ann, I have $5,000 for you. And she said, I think you should come up right away. You went through money at quite a clip there, and always hard to know what you were going to be asked to spend it on. I mean, I guess in a way, public radio was a little bit under the radar of these American television networks that were passing it over by the suitcase full. But still, that's a hard thing to know what to do. Are you going to pay to stay? How much are you going to pay to stay? You have to make that judgment yourself almost on an hourly basis in those final days.
I mean, there was a rate card, an official rate card, just for the pleasure of staying in Baghdad. Officially, we had to pay per person $200 a day, for which we got nothing.
The sat phone cost you?
The sat phone was $100, and my presence in Baghdad would cost $100. I mean, that was official. You got a receipt for that. And then there were all sorts of, to try and get a visa. I didn't find that vast sums, or I didn't have vast sums. I worked for NPR, and frankly, they weren't doing it because, the networks were, I can't absolutely prove it, but I have been told by any number of people at the networks we're paying thousands upon thousands of dollars. That was just out of my league. I gave, guy 100 here and 100 there to take my phone calls when I came back from this, when I would call from the States, and in the hope I would get a visa. The visa game, you have to understand, from October up to and during the war was a huge money-making operation for the Iraqi authorities. And they would let us in for 10 days, and maybe we could squirm a few more days out of them. But the networks were there, basically, they were there all the time, and they were paying dearly for it. It's raised some real questions in the minds of a lot of us about how we should all operate under these circumstances in a police state.
I know
it's not a happy operation.
John Burns has been writing about it, and others since then, and I wanted to ask you, it's got to be a healthy thing if those questions are seriously thought about, because at the extreme end, the idea that you're paying huge bribes to tell a story that you don't get to control, at some point, you're not really doing your job as a journalist.
That's right, and of course the irony is that the networks and CNN were paying huge bribes to stay for what they thought was going to be the big story, and then in the end, frankly, they fled. I don't belittle the fear and the real danger that we all faced, and anybody who wanted to leave Baghdad was, in my view, justified. But nothing changed, really. What was interesting to me is that there was nothing different about Baghdad and the prospect of war at the beginning of March and in the middle of March when the clock started ticking. Nothing changed substantially. It was the same danger. And why they suddenly, we all thought the networks and CNN would stay. It was shocking to us when we looked around on the last, as the clock ticked down, and went, 16? NPR? The New York Review of Books? A New Yorker? It was a very strange group.
But you write in the book, and you know, though, that those are days that you can't predict. Those are days when you're moving from one hotel to another hotel. Somebody's got a rumor from Washington that they're going to hit the foreign ministry, and no, they're going to be aiming at the Al Rashid Hotel, and we have to move somewhere else. And that gets the pulse going.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the problem was the rumors. I mean, nothing in fact had changed. We knew the Al Rashid was a target. You know, we knew that we had to find somewhere safe. That all of those facts had been known for, weeks, months, whatever. But it started to get loopy with rumors. And then bosses in Washington suddenly realized that they didn't want to take responsibility for having their reporters there, that it was just too dangerous. They didn't want to write a eulogy. And so they started pulling journalists. Other journalists were trying to defy their bosses to stay. I mean, it was crazy, and some just plain lost it, and got scared. I mean, and the other problem was the Iraqis weren't quite sure if they wanted us to be there. So one day they would say, "Okay, you're all going to have to leave in 2 days." And then they'd go back on it and say, "Oh, you can stay." So there was always this, there was just a huge number of sort of craziness going on.
Well, what was it for you, though? Had you made your decision when you went there initially and you just stuck with that? Did you review it every day, talking to Vin, talking to the desk? How did you ultimately decide?
Well, of course I reviewed it, but basically the key factor for me was once I had established a relationship with this one particular Iraqi who was my driver. He was not Omar, who was not a government official. I mean, he initially was nothing more than a driver for me, but he clearly was extraordinary. And I had been there for so many months on and off since October, so I knew Iraqis. I knew I'd seen the bombing in 91 and again in 98. I knew that wasn't the real problem, shock and awe notwithstanding. What I didn't know was how the Iraqi authorities were going to behave in the end, and were they going to take us hostage in a desperate last. And I didn't know that, and couldn't answer that question in my own mind. But I figured it was worth the risk in the end. It was a gut instinct, if you will. I can't say why, but now looking back on it, hey, I'm fine.
I knew that you'd been
thinner, but fine.
I knew you'd been in Moscow, and you write in your book, I'm going to quote you here, "It's been almost 25 years since I started out as a correspondent in Moscow. I so remember my first day in the bug department wondering how the hell I was going to cover the country." And I thought as I read that the kind of uncertainty and the kind of unknowing that you learned to live with when you were, who was General Secretary? Brezhnev was still General Secretary. When you under that kind of regime, you learned that you don't get to know everything that's going to go on, but that there's still a story to tell. And I wanted to, if you leaned at all on what you'd learned in your time on the other side of the Iron Curtain in figuring out how to work in a country that's run by a dictator, how to work as a journalist when you don't really know who's ratting on you, how to make a decision day to day what the next story ought to be.
Absolutely. I think there's no question that having worked in a police state before, although the Brezhnev years look simple compared to Saddam. I mean, Saddam was Stalinist if the last years of the Soviet regime were Brezhnev. People are afraid to talk to you. And it was much easier doing it with radio than it was for television because, you raise a camera and it's like raising an M16, everybody scatters. I have great sympathy for television trying to work in that kind of environment. But, Omar, once again, I mean, that was critical for me, was finding Iraqis who would offer to help and wanted to help and understood the dangers. Omar was in a perfect position as my driver. And then as it got chaotic during the war, and he knew the regime as well as anyone and how to work around it. And I mean, he would often say, no, I can't do that, that's too dangerous. But sometimes when the authorities would lock me in the hotel or and all the other journalists, he would go out and look and see, what had been bombed, what the mood was. And because I knew him so well over the months, I knew that he was a superb and very accurate observer. In fact, he had incredible reverence for truth and facts precisely because he lived in a regime that did not. And he had been always so careful. So by that point, I knew that I could trust him as my eyes and ears when I could not go out. Obviously, it was preferable for me to do it, but sometimes that just wasn't possible. And those were all, skills that I had learned in many ways in the former Soviet Union when I had given Super 8 cameras in those days to any number of people who took film for me, to dissidents, if you will. And I had gotten film of Andrei Sakharov out of when he was in exile in Gorky that way. And so experience came to play in more ways than one. Also, one thing that came to play, when I was in those early years in Moscow, I was young, intrepid, and pretty stupidly brash. This time I was, I hope, intrepid, but, a little older, more mature, didn't get into fights with officials the same way, didn't just shove it in their face the way I used to. And I think that really helped. I just kind of looked like a dumb broad and, went under the radar. Maturity has definitely helped compared to the way I behaved in 1980 and 82.
You've also seen statues come down before and know that the world doesn't change the day after the bronze hits the pavement.
That's right. I think that's my proudest day, in fact, covering this covering up to and during the immediate aftermath was when, that you all remember the pictures of the statue coming down and not coincidentally out in the square right outside the Palestine Hotel where all the journalists had to live like a reform school. And, the pictures that were shown gave this idea maybe of what everybody hoped for, that, look, everybody is applauding the American troops and Saddam is pulled down and it's victory. And I've seen, as you say, I've seen statues pulled down in any number of countries, most poignantly in the former Soviet Union. And I knew that pulling down statues doesn't mean anything. It doesn't begin to answer the questions of how you got there and where you're going to go from here. And indeed, as I spoke to people in the square, yes, there were some jubilant people, but there were probably more who were just standing there in shock and saying, what next? And there was a professor who I knew who happened to be in the square, and he came up to me and he said, you now understand the Americans will have to take complete control. Look at the city. There's a vacuum of authority. And he said, and we will resent them every step of the way. Iraqis, what was extraordinary was how well Iraqis knew themselves.
And I was struck at the tail end of the book when you describe Omar, the man who valued truth in a country that did not, cried when the statue came down. Explain that for us.
I think he shared it was, why did the Americans have to do it? Why couldn't
it was like humiliation on top of?
Yes, it was humiliation. Why did it take the Americans to do this? Why couldn't the Iraqis? And you have to, when Omar comes from one of the tribes, Iraq being, basically divided up into tribes. Now, it makes it sound very primitive. It's very elaborate family relationships.
Think of them as clans in Scotland.
Yeah,
it's a little easier.
Yeah, more, exactly. Thank you. But of course, then Iraqi tribes are divided up into clans too. So then we, okay. But His family was Sunni Muslim like Saddam, and comes from the region which is actually now opposing the Americans, and he comes from Ramadi. And so his background altogether was, he was a bundle of contradictions. Here he was, this Sunni Muslim who in some ways could have benefited from Saddam, chose not to, chose not to marry a first cousin, as most Iraqis do, chose to move out on his own into Baghdad, considered himself an Iraqi first and foremost rather than a Sunni or a Shiite or whatever. He's a very interesting man, and I think like many, it was, he wanted Saddam gone, but the fact that it was the Americans who had to do it, he was sobbing when I came upstairs. He said, "This is not a great day for us," much as he loathed Saddam Hussein.
There was a day, and everybody in this room who was listening to radio and watching the television will remember it, because it was one of those few days in the midst of all that craziness when we had an image, television image, and something described to us by reporters that was something other than just the bombs landing in Baghdad. Do you remember when the soldiers were running up and down the banks of the Tigris River, firing their AK-47s into the water and kicking through the reeds? It was a very, very strange day, and a bizarre one for you, as you describe it. That's a day when Vint Lawrence writes, "Annie slept soundly through the lullaby of Baghdad last night. Even through the dodgy satellite phone connection, her voice was strong and her mood determined." Vince in the front row here. Can you just stand up and show?
Yes, go on.
Come on now.
I have a great husband, everybody, who's also a wonderful writer.
He is, and I want to talk about the way that Vince emails complement the work that you do in the book, because at the same time as we know what's going on, we're getting your description, we're getting his Brenda Starr version. Who were those emails going to anyway? At times I'm...
Well, that's a good question. We thought they were just going to sort of a small circle of family and friends, but then when
the forward button on...
and then when we sort of were getting replies and comments from people in Alaska, and it was going really... They were going very far afield. And they had been quite open in some ways.
Were you reading them at the time?
I read them until Vince stopped sending me at a point at the very beginning of the war, because I think he was expressing his concerns and the rumors that were flying around about me staying and what other people were saying about me staying, and he thought it was better that I didn't see those. Although in the end he did, when he realized that I knew them all the rumors and more, he then sent them on.
There's also a time in that same week when you and Susie Goldenberg go out under, I think it's nighttime when you went out to visit the family?
No, it was actually early in the morning.
Okay, early in the morning. Well, you tell the story. I'm pulling it from my own memory.
Well, it was just we were under, basically locked in the hotel a lot of the time, or if we weren't, the authorities told us that, we couldn't go see families, we couldn't go speak to people. Some journalists who had just gone shopping, for food had been detained in their rooms. But Susie and I were going nuts. And so we went out, we were at the information ministry, and then sort of did a dodge and got a taxi and went out to a neighborhood and had the taxi drop us at a restaurant, not at the house we were really going to. And then we took a risk by sort of sauntering down a street and saw some friends who lived next door to an Air Force base where cruise missiles had been slamming into the Air Force base. But in some ways, these people had already lived through the bombing of 91, 98. They knew that the Air Force base was going to be hit, but they knew that their house, even though it was literally only a block away and most of the glass had broken, that the house would be okay. The glass would break, but they would be okay if they slept in one room down in the middle.
Now, Susie's Canadian, writing for a British paper, but you can't make any secret of the fact that you're American, reporting for National Public Radio in the United States. It is the Americans who are dropping these bombs on this family. And you show up And I'm asking you the question because I still can't quite figure out the answer to it. You show up making no secret about who you are, and these people want to tell you their story. They don't want to grab you by the throat and say, send the message back to your president, blah, blah, blah.
They were, they wanted an end to the regime, desperately wanted an end to the regime. But they weren't sure that the Americans were the one to do it. And they weren't sure that the Americans were up to the task of what it would mean when the regime was over. They knew perfectly well that this country was going to fracture into bits, that there was going to be looting, violence, crime in the aftermath. They predicted exactly what was going to happen. They were fearful of that. And, these people had made their peace in a funny way with, not made their peace, but they had somehow in a way made a lot of compromises and figured out a way to survive Saddam.
But for some reason, though they know you're American, they don't connect you as American to the American bombs
forgive
coming
me, yes,
down.
I see your... No, and that was true of Iraqis again and again. They love Americans. Whatever they thought of the government, they make a very distinct, they make a real distinction between Americans and the American government, again and again. Now, sometimes they just said that. They loved the American government too, but they couldn't possibly say that under Saddam, and they desperately wanted the Americans to come in and get rid of Saddam. And they would make this fake distinction between, or not fake, but they would deliberately say people are different from the government. But many people made that distinction and were enormously welcoming. And many have family in the States. There was one really peculiar moment where just as the regime is about to fall, the troops are on the outskirts of town, and Saddam's people had this propaganda thing outside the Palestine Hotel, and they brought out musicians and a big thing with a new song about Saddam that would run every night on television. And the sign was up there with a bouncing ball, follow the words, and all the crowds were brought out to sing it, and there was a musician there, and I was trying to find out what the words to this new song was, what the words were, and I went up to this distinguished-looking musician, and he spoke wonderful English, and he said, "Oh, by the way, my son lives in Chicago, and he's got his green card, and he's going to be a citizen in a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, he's conducting this song to Saddam." And I said, "It doesn't seem strange to you?" And he said, and I think the bottom line is whatever he thought about Saddam, he said, "I love my country, and I am glad that my son has a future in your country." And in some ways, I think he truly believed that. Now, it was still at a dodgy time when it was to speak, but I think his answer actually wouldn't be different today than it was then.
I wonder if it's that the people in that country have just learned to live with such unimaginable contradictions that we never think about having to rationalize. There's a president who people like, everything's good, the president people don't like, everything's bad. I think
it's also that people are afraid of them. There are many different elements. Now, I often think of the former Soviet Union. Saddam, as awful as he was, like Stalin in a way, who killed, innumerable people, innocent people, put the Soviet Union on the map. And Saddam, in a way, put Iraq on the map for many Iraqis, much as they'll sort of recall the early days, the early Saddam, with a kind of nostalgia. They know that he became corrupt and it all and launched wars that destroyed any of the good that was formed, but there is a sense of that Iraq was a leader in the area. Iraqis are, with all of their oil wealth, are unlike many of their neighbors in the Gulf, because they have built their own country. It has not been built by foreign workers. They have utter disdain for the Kuwaitis because they say, We get education. We build our own country. So it's, I mean, Iraqis have a very, even though they're still grappling with a sense of country at one level because it's of the divisions between Sunni, Shia, Kurds, whatever, and also regional divisions between clans and tribes and whatever. They nonetheless, there is a growing sense of real pride in being an Iraqi. And the other part of it is they're afraid of themselves, and they knew how difficult things would be. And they knew how hard it would be for the United States when the United States came in. And I think they're disappointed now and sort of say, you see, we knew the U.S. can't secure this country. It's worse than it was.
So further step into the psyche. Do you think that a good number of Iraqis take a secret kind of pleasure in the fact that Saddam Hussein continues to elude the American forces? Do you think anything will change?
I don't think anybody, I mean, apart from some Sunni holdouts and members of his tribe and tribes that really feel that they have everything to lose now, that they're going to pay for having been the beneficiaries for so long. No, I don't think that. I think people are they're exhausted at this point. Remember, they've lived under 13 years of sanctions. Their patience was already at an end. They had inflated ideas, contradiction. They had both inflated ideas about what the U.S. would do when it came in, or else they knew in their gut that this was going to be a real mess that nobody could handle. I mean, it is interesting that the number of troops, though, it sounds like a whole lot, 130,000. That's actually per capita a lot less than was in the Balkans. And clearly, from the very first day, Iraqis saw that the U.S. had underestimated the problem. I mean, when they heard that Rumsfeld was talking about reducing the troops to 30,000, I mean, there was just sheer panic. When he thought it clear that they thought it was going to be much easier. And then when the looting went on, okay, 1 day of looting, 2 days, a month of it, and it was not stopped. And that has, of course, made it that much harder for Iraqis to sort of take control of their own lives, the very ministries, unfortunately, records. I mean, imagine living in Boston and you don't have traffic records, police records, education records, school records, college, you can't, nothing. And you're trying to get the country back up and going and figure out who's who and
You've done one reporting trip since...
yeah, I just was there for 6 weeks.
And in that time, Ann, did you get a feeling that people are judging the future of their country on their own well-being, their job, their access to basic services, or that they're still thinking of their future in larger terms, like I hope they get Saddam, and I hope that the provisional authority does X, Y? How consumed are people just by making it day to day? Yeah,
they're consumed by day to day. They're scared. They're scared of the nights. You don't have electricity, or very rarely at night. Most people can't afford a generator. Most people are out of work. The provisional authority is beginning to pay more and more people, or get salaries going. But most people work for the government, and most of the government buildings were destroyed. So you had a real catch-22 in the beginning. They're scared. You don't see women on, or you didn't. You're beginning to see a few more, but you just didn't see women on the streets. Men wouldn't let their wives and children go out.
Too unsafe.
That's what they believed. Yeah, there were a lot of rumors but that's gotten a little bit better. I mean, during the day it's better. You see more women out on the streets now during the day. And if you were in Baghdad now, during the day it's busy, and there's lots of, in fact, too busy. Their traffic is terrible because there aren't any traffic police, and there are no traffic lights because there's not electricity, or not enough electricity to run the traffic lights. You imagine Boston with its reputation. But I mean, in Baghdad, it's nuts. And so it's exhausting. People are just, and they don't know what next. They don't know who the 25 members really are. I mean, who these, especially the exiles. Right. The U.S. military has done, they can be applauded for any number of things they've done, but as a police force, unfortunately, they can be a very blunt weapon. And a lot of Iraqi civilians have been killed in raids and checkpoints that were just raids that went bad, checkpoints that were badly managed. And initially, Iraqis would watch the new television station, their only television access. I mean, they can watch satellite too, and it's very popular. But then they got Arabiya or Al Jazeera, which is completely slanted in one angle, and they were watching their own new TV station, which is being paid for by the American Provisional Authority, and it's not very good, unfortunately. It's underfunded. Surprise, surprise. The reporters aren't very experienced yet. They don't have enough camera crews, and most of it was very Pollyanna-ish. And initially, Paul Bremer, the head of the American Occupation Authority, was also, just saying that everything is just hunky-dory and fine. And many Iraqis would say, I don't know who's worse, this new media or Baghdad Bob. I mean, this is nuts. I mean, we've just traded one for another. So there was this sort of credibility gap, and they would sort of listen, and everybody's saying, oh, it's fine. And they go, what country do you live in? That has gotten a little bit better now.
I just wanted to mention, we've got a couple of mics here, and Anne will stay and answer some of your questions if there's something that you want to ask her about. So I'll give you a few minutes to find your way to a mic if you're interested in doing that. There's a day that you described that strikes me more than any of your time there, and I don't know whether or not it was having worked there both when Saddam Hussein was in control and then coming in after he left. The day you got up and found everybody gone. Yeah. I can't imagine what it felt like. You must have wondered just what was going on. Because you didn't expect that, did you?
You always wondered. I mean, this particular morning, I got up early. I went downstairs in the Palestine, and it was other journalists were still asleep, but there were no Iraqi security. The information ministry was dark. All the thugs who had been around, gone, evaporated. I went out on the streets. The Ba'ath Party members in their just distinctive green uniforms, gone. Nothing. It was the strangest, and after a moment of, yes, then I got scared because, the hotel was full of journalists. This is a cash economy. And I could begin to hear people started, even at 8:30, people began to come and say there's looting going on. And I went, uh-oh, it's going to roll towards us. And, we had a lot of, all of us combined had a lot of cash on us. They don't take credit cards in Baghdad. And I thought, oh my, and we've got equipment and whatever, and everybody knows where we are. So, I sort of went from, elation to sort of raw fear, and then the fighting on the streets began to get bad. It was, but they had, and we'd always wondered.
Fighting between the Americans and the Iraqis, so
yes,
people went back into their homes.
The bombing more or less stopped at that point, and the troops, even though Baghdad Bob, the information minister, had long been saying that, no, the troops aren't at the airport, You want to go out and see him? No problem. You know, you want to go out and see how everything is just fine at the airport, at which point every other Iraqi official in the room is just turning green going, oh my God. Because they knew, and then so we then said, well, sir, if that's the case, may we go to the airport? And he said, well, absolutely. So after he left, we went to the Iraqi officials and said, hey, we want to go to the airport. And they're going, are you out of your minds? You'll get killed. You know, and we don't want to die. So we always wondered, though, I mean, they knew the truth. They knew what was going on, and they knew that there was going to be a moment when it just went, and but they wouldn't ever talk about it. And I was only when I went back this time, and I tried to get answers to the questions from some people as to what were you thinking? I mean, you knew that it was, and they were just waiting for the moment. Either they were too scared, they said they were too scared to leave because other officials sort of had their number and would get their families, or they had to stay there. And then one official said that he would always deliberately get behind the information minister so that his wife, who was in the countryside, would see that he was alive until the information minister sort of went going, why do you go away, you know, what are you doing there, you know, but, you know, it was just everybody obviously, and then this magical moment when they just, poof, gone.
Yeah, one of those few transforming moments. Let's start over here at this microphone. Ma'am, go ahead.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hear you in person and to be with Dick, too. You said something that struck me very much, and I don't know whether you'd want to expand on it or not, but it was, why did the Americans have to do this? And a number of us held signs for many months, war is not the answer. Yet when we were asked, what is the alternative, we didn't have good answers. And I'm impressed by the work of Gene Sharp and others in the Force More Powerful concepts of other movements in other countries over time where the people within the country were able to change their government. And I wondered if you wanted to make any comment on that. I know that may be a little beyond the scope of your work.
Can I ask you if your question is, had the Americans not gone in when they did, were the Iraqis anywhere close to taking care of business themselves?
Yes. Was there any sense of a movement within the country?
Thanks.
Sadly, no. And that was really the essence of Omar's dilemma and why he was in tears. I mean, he knew the Iraqis couldn't do it, and that they were nowhere near a point where that was going to happen, but still didn't want the Americans to. You know, it was a push me, pull me. Nonetheless, many Iraqis were always baffled by, I mean, they would ask, why now? What's the rush? I think they sensed that, some sense, said to me, you need a coalition. Why is the U.S. rushing to do this alone? Because it's going to take more than the U.S. And they wanted more than the U.S. Involved. And that question came up again and again. Let the inspectors do their job. It's not 98 where they've been stymied. But there were indeed other Iraqis who were just desperate that Saddam be overthrown and just said, come in at any, whatever.
Thanks for that. Over here, ma'am.
I have a couple of very quick points to request input from you, ma'am. Is it really true that Iraqi women right now are in a worse situation than they were before? Because I read in the newspaper that they are now in voluntary seclusion, deliberate seclusion to avoid rape or murder. My other question is that as someone living very far away here, I'm not an Iraqi, I was born in India, etc., but I'm an American citizen. Seems that we Americans are making some terrible mistakes in winning the peace. The killing of the Iraqi police recently who were shouting in English in broad daylight, "Police, police." The killing of Saddam Hussein's 14-year-old grandson was hiding under a bed. The gunning down of a 12-year-old boy who had just peeped his little head on the rooftop during a very hot night during the war, and GIs allegedly who had shot him prevented the boy from being rushed to a military hospital, that the boy bled to death. None of these things would be regarded as winning the peace. I'd be grateful for any input you or Dick Gordon might have. Thank you.
On the issue of women, for women in general, the situation has been deteriorating really since the late 80s. As basically Iraq was bankrupted by the Iran-Iraq War and then subsequently by the invasion of Kuwait and the sanctions, women have suffered probably more than children the most, but women have paid a big price. When a family can't afford to educate all the children, the first to lose out are the girls. And literacy in the country has dropped from about 88% to 45% as a result, with the biggest hit being taken by girls. Demographics are completely skewed because of the Saddam regime and the wars. So many men have been killed, and then so many millions more, in fact, have left the country for jobs, that this has completely distorted family life and the life of women. Any number of young middle-class girls who should have been educated, who would have been educated 15 years ago, their families are now pressuring them to marry because there aren't enough men. And so at 16, instead of getting an education and going on, as many Iraqi women did, there weren't the jobs, there was high unemployment, and there weren't enough men. So there's the issue now of women being inside. I mean, I mentioned it earlier. Yes, that is the case, but I think that's a temporary phenomenon. But it's what Iraq is and the women is in the future, and the kind of society it's going to be, and what kind. I mean, it will be an Islamic in some form or another. I make that assumption, as I think most Iraqis do, but sort of how conservative it becomes over time. It's become more conservative over time, as the region has, and also as Saddam used religion, people also sought solace in religion. So this is also played a part. An example of how explosive this might just be, one of the first decisions by the governing council was to allow women to travel abroad alone without a male relative, a brother, uncle, father, traveling with her. And while this was hailed by many, I can assure you I also heard outraged comments by other more conservative Iraqis. So these sorts of issues will be played out, and we'll see. Sadly, of course, we know that a member of the governing council, woman, and a moderate at that, and a Shiite who could have played a very key role, was assassinated. As for the I won't comment on the specific incidents you've mentioned. There have been unfortunate incidents when the military has killed innocent bystanders. This, some of this is inevitable in an ongoing conflict with an invisible enemy, but. I have spoken to military officers who have been critical of the way they've conducted raids and the way raids have been conducted. They are learning on the ground, but in the first 4 or 5 months, some very bad mistakes were made. And the fact that the U.S., the Provisional Authority, would not even comment on Iraqi civilians sort of led many Iraqis to say, don't we even exist? I mean, who do you think lives here? The Americans would document each soldier who was killed correctly, I think, but would absolutely ignore the issue of Iraqi civilian casualties. That has begun to change, but And I think Bremer is beginning to realize that other, you've got to admit that Iraqis actually live in Iraq. And when he said to the Hill, more and more Iraqis are seeing us as occupiers, not liberators. So, I mean, that's a refreshing acknowledgement that things, that there are problems on the ground that need to be resolved. I mean, nobody's saying this is simple, but the fact that I think the civilian administration is now facing up to those problems and saying they exist is healthy for everybody.
But how much patience is there, though? I wonder too about the question. I'm thinking back to the time when all the Iraqi policemen were killed, and I read the story and heard it on the radio that day, and I thought to myself, this is an event that has the potential to be somewhat iconic in this moment, where people will say, that was the moment, forget it, the Americans are never going to get it right. But there continues to be some patience or tolerance beyond that. And
if only because they're terrified. I mean, even when they say, even some of the most conservative religious figures, when they say we want the Americans out, and I've asked them, now? And they go, well, not right now. I mean, they know perfectly well that if the Americans leave now, Iraqis will beat each other's throats. And so that is tempering some of the fury that people feel. But I have seen, I have been in neighborhoods on many an occasion on several occasions when raids have gone bad and civilians, families, children have been killed. And, at the funerals you hear the word jihad coming out of the mouths of the mourners. And these are middle class, basically neutral, probably wanted the Americans in the first place.
let's go back to our microphones. We'll try to be a little faster. I see the lineup's getting a little longer. Sir, go ahead.
Sure. And a lot of us are very delighted that you survived. I happen to be one who's been listening to you since you were in Moscow, and I remember thinking you were a gutsy woman then. It's nice to see you in person. Keep at it, please. It makes me, seeing you in person makes me feel how too bad it is there isn't a visual documentary of you at work.
I looked really bad in Baghdad, my dear.
I can talk about that, actually.
Yeah,
and he can testify to this.
There is a question.
There is a really good reason.
And we all hope you'll answer it. But the one I want to ask you is, what would you advise policymakers, decision makers in the UN and the United States today, if you could get them to listen to you?
I don't think that's my job. I really mean it. I mean, I think I've made it clear where I think where,
I understand.
Things. There was no question that I think the administration was terribly naive about the Iraq it would face in the aftermath. The Iraqis had long made it clear. I mean, that's why my job there was to listen to Iraqis. I just had one very small window on this whole, exercise. And Iraqis knew perfectly well how complicated it would be. As I don't make predictions and, prescriptions, I would just say the good news that I have seen in the last, few weeks is an acknowledgement at last, so that Iraqis are not saying this is like, as I said, looking at their own TV and listening to the Americans and going, so what's the difference between these guys and Baghdad Bob?
The other thing, too, is Anne's job is to tell us stories, not to broadcast to the administration. They have lots of satellite equipment and lots of very smart people on the ground who can give them advice about what they think they ought to do. And I think, just in sort of thinking how I would answer the question you posed, and it really isn't our job. If we're doing our level best to make sure that American listeners are as informed as possible, and the best expression of a functioning democracy is that then the listeners talk to their politicians, and that's where the policy changes come from? I hope that doesn't sound like I'm ducking the question, but I really
Well, we are
understand.
ducking, but I mean,
I want to
correctly.
Right.
Yeah, but correctly. I mean, that's not my job.
I understand. It's just that those of us at home are listening to you and gathering news from where we can, and we have to advise our policymakers. And we
Go with your gut. It works for Ann.
I mean, my job, the way I see my job is, I mean, at the very, in the aftermath, I talked to soldiers, we saw the looting, I talked to soldiers, asked them, why aren't you doing anything? He said, we don't have any orders to do anything. I am a witness reporting what people say about given situations, as many people from various perspectives as I can. But the rest of it, that's why politicians make such big money. And I work for NPR.
So then please do answer the question that's on everybody's mind. How did the book get its name? Tell us.
How what?
How did the book get its name?
Its name. Tell us the story.
Oh, how many people in this room know the story by now? Writing that. But for those poor benighted souls, it actually was, let me just tell you, naming a book is one of the worst things. I was hurtling through this, trying to write it in a matter of a month, and so I could go back to Baghdad. And the title came up. Well, Baghdad Diary, nice, neutral, whatever. Title taken. Sorry. So then it was from the Palestine Hotel. They'll think it's about the Middle East come September. They'll have forgotten the Palestine Hotel and they'll think it's about the West Bank. Okay. Well, naked in Baghdad. A little too salacious, some said. But Susan Stamberg managed to elicit from me in an interview that, in fact, I had indeed been naked when I broadcast in a desperate attempt to hide my phone from the Iraqi security people. I figured it would, if the light was out and I didn't have any clothes on, and they would walk by the door, see that there was no light there, and they wouldn't see the reflection of the antenna out the window, and either hopefully just walk by, or if they did knock, I could pretend I was asleep and say, "Oh my God, you just woke me up," give them a little shoulder, and then shut the door, hide the phone, and it was desperate. What can I tell you? But I mean, I had no choice.
To this microphone over here. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, we all know that Iraq is more than just the city of Baghdad. It's a big country, probably the size of California. I think it's been compared to that. I was just wondering, you said that you have recently been back there for 6 weeks. Did you confine your residence there to Baghdad, or did you go out into what has become known as the Sunni Triangle? And one of the reasons I'm asking that is that a friend of mine has recently returned from Iraq on a rotation leave. He's a lieutenant colonel, and he was the civil affairs officer in Tikrit. And my 4th Infantry Division and Task Force Iron Horse is commanded by General Odierno, whom I've met. As a matter of fact, I was just with his wife a couple of weeks ago down at Fort Hood. We have a historian who is in contact with all of the 4th Division Iron Horse men who were over there. And they give him reports, and he writes a daily update of what's going on in their particular area. And he gets reports from officers there telling what wonderful work they're actually doing, about the number of schools that they've repaired, the dedication of chalkboards to the kids and getting the schools back functioning.
And you're not hearing these stories.
And that's right. Yeah, that's what they're complaining about. They say that the news media is reporting only the bad things and not the good things. And knowing my 4th Infantry Division soldiers, they wouldn't do anything that wasn't good. I mean, they're dedicated and they're good. I've spent time with them down at Fort Hood and so forth and so on. So I was just wondering if you think, and this would be a comment on your part, do you think that these people are writing these stories because if they're out, the most of them are officers. Do you think they're doing it just to enhance their own military careers, or
But
are
good
they,
ones, you mean?
Yeah, or are they?
No, I mean, the military is doing a lot of really good stuff. And in fact, the military is probably doing just about anything that's being done in Iraq right now, because the civilians are so scared for their lives that they're living behind, coils of barbed wire and sandbags. And the civilian administration under Bremer is tucked away in one of Saddam's palaces. I mean, you can't get there. I mean, 4 body searches and whatever later, maybe. And so the military is out there doing local elections, building schools, village councils, town councils, city councils, hospitals. Sometimes they're good at this. This is well beyond the mandate of many of them and their training. I mean, civil affairs officers have...
That's what they complain about. They complain we weren't trained for this.
Well, that's right. And some of them aren't very good at it either. Some of them are superb. I mean, I have seen some people in Sadr City. I mean, I have been up in the Sunni Triangle and whatever, and they're... But, I mean, in one instance, I saw brilliant people in Sadr City who... civil affairs officers, and this is part of Baghdad, the Shiite area, poor area of Baghdad, and some dumb military had tried to pull down a religious flag from a helicopter, and so, I mean, it was one of the most inflammatory gestures you could think of. Meanwhile, really smart military on the ground jumped to stop 25,000 people who had massed in the center and were ready to let rip across all of Baghdad, and they diffused this potential crisis, and I mean in a matter of hours, by getting hold of all the right people immediately. And the problem is a lot of soldiers, and I'm sorry, but it was the 4th up in the Sunni Triangle, and many of them had no cultural training. Many of them dealt with tribal leaders in ways that were unnecessarily offensive. They went in to do arrests, and they took, tribal leader and put his forehead on the ground with his foot on the head. And the problem is, you do it once or twice, and it begins to take on mythic proportions in the community. These are very conservative rural communities, and they don't look fondly on the Americans in the first place. So they're all looking for a reason to point to them. And I mean, it started out with immediately in that, and the troops did a great job in another instance when up there, and it happened actually all over, the word went out that the American night vision goggles, I can't tell you, people really did believe that you could see through women's clothes. That's what they were for. You laugh. This got to be a huge issue. And so finally, the troops found out about this, and they went to the schools and invited the parents, and they let them look through the glasses and realize, no, it doesn't take away their clothes. But people wouldn't send their kids to school and they were getting to be some really nasty incidents with the troops over this. And that was the kind of rumor that gets spread. I mean, these are illiterate. I mean, Iraq's confusing because on the one hand it can be extremely sophisticated, educated, and the next turn of the road you're dealing with illiterate, very rural, very traditional sort of families where the women never emerge from the walls of the house. So, it can be very confusing for somebody who's just arrived there and is trying to negotiate, a very difficult policing job. So the answer is there's a little bit of everything, and I think it's getting a little bit better now than it was. I mean, when I was there, albeit August, there was cultural training underway. That's already 4 months after they've been in Iraq.
Thanks for your question. Over here. Sir, go ahead.
I'm thinking about the way the president characterizes things at times, and I'd like to call upon your experience to try to sort this out. President tells us, for example, that we are, I think at least the most recent iteration, that we are there to help to bring democracy to the people of Iraq. So my first question is, to what extent is there any sort of realistic basis to think that democracy is going to take root there? And I guess I'm asking that, in my own view, that the president sees that it's going to be pretty much as its American democracy. That may or may not be so, but I don't think he troubles himself a lot with a lot of sophisticated understanding of Iraqi culture and politics. The second part of what I'm interested in is we hear about the forces of evil, fighting the forces of evil, that sort of crusade lingo that the president puts out there, bring it on, so forth. Should we have a sense that there really are, at this time, significantly organized resistances against Americans being there? And if not, can you project in the circumstances now how long it will take if things go on our side the way they are before that takes root?
Let's start with the first one about how Iraqis hear the word democracy when it comes from American leaders' lips. What does it mean to them?
They love it, but they don't believe that, they think that they need a strong leader. I mean, in truth, you ask them, they don't see how this is exactly going to play out. But it's all too new at this juncture.
Is there any model they look at? Is there any other state in the Middle East or anywhere where they say it would be nice if it worked like that? See, he's strong and he... No.
No, and they know how much resentment there is because of 30 years with the Sunni and specifically Saddam's tribes. And there was I think it was yesterday's New York Times, there was also, they know themselves, once again, and they fear that another tribe will come in and be the president, even albeit an elected president, but it is an Iraqi's responsibility to his tribe to help the tribe's members, and that they will be the beneficiaries of his position. So how this plays out is still very unclear, and they're still waiting at this point just to see how the governing council, a group of of diverse people from diverse parts of Iraqi life, work together. That's unclear.
So if a tribal leader is never elected,
but everybody's a member of a tribe.
Okay, but if the tribal leader has that position because of birth, because he's inherited that, so you don't have any kind of ground level basis of electoral politics or any way to build up that sense of municipal local elections. Does that mean that when Iraqis hear about American democracy, including elections at some point in the future, that they actually see themselves as being able to choose someone who will be their strong leader, or is it too confusing at this point?
In theory, they understand it, but I don't think they understand yet how it is going to apply in Iraq and how it will really work out without violence, corruption. They're frightened of it. I mean, they want it and they're frightened of it.
And the idea, or the other second part of the question about the degree to which the resistance is organized as opposed to sort of grassroots level. Any idea, any sense of that when you're there?
It's very hard to know exactly where the opposition is coming from. I mean, I've met people who have made it clear to me they support the opposition without saying they're actually part of it, mainly remnants of the military or Saddam's members of the Sunni tribes who had benefit under Saddam. And also, it may be that they've teamed up with some of the Shiite radical conservative clerics who have emerged from the shadows now. The problem of the security vacuum, though, I think is that, if it will be very dangerous if security and is not reestablished and Iraq sort of held together, and Iraqis given a chance to rebuild in a constructive way. Otherwise, I think we will have will have turned what was a potential threat into a very real one. With the borders unchecked at this point, I've seen many foreign fighters there. I've seen Algerians, Tunisians, Syrians, Yemeni. Now, how many are there and how many would like to be and how many are attracted to come to Iraq to fight the infidel, as they would put it, I don't know. But it could certainly, if there's a security vacuum, we saw what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, it just becomes a playground for people looking for training camps, a place to have training camps.
You don't have a time frame sense, though.
Excuse me?
You don't have a time frame sense that if this goes on like it is now for another year, we're in big trouble?
No.
Thank you very much.
No.
Thank you. I'm going to take the next question from here because I know you've been on your feet a little longer, and then I'll come over to you, sir. Just bear with me. Go ahead, Matt.
And you write in your book that you turned down Sierra Leone because you didn't feel you had the instincts to survive in Africa. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. Why not Africa? And also, just in general, about those core instincts and traits that you do draw on, that you feel that you need to do the work that you do all over the world. Thank you.
You know, if I had started out in Africa as a 22, as a young person, it's at this point in my career I've only worked in North Africa a little bit, and to be thrown in cold to a civil war in Sierra Leone, I knew was, and in fact my colleague was killed, a friend of mine at Reuters. Anyway, it's a long story, but you got to draw the line somewhere, and I knew, at least when I began my career, I spoke Russian, so I went to the former Soviet Union. I felt I learned in the Cold War, if you will. So by the time the hot war emerged after it broke up in '91, the war I knew the place. And because I knew that part of the world, maybe I felt a little bit more comfortable in Bosnia. And God knows, 1991 in Saudi Arabia, when I first got my taste of that region, it wasn't a dangerous war to cover. I mean, most of us just sat in Saudi Arabia and watched planes take off for a long time while we got a taste of the region. I mean, that wasn't. So, but you make decisions based on, I can't, why here, why there? Why did I understand the Soviet Union? Why did I ever learn Russian in the first place? Don't ask.
Sir.
Interested in your view on the Defense Department's embedding reporters, journalists with line units. Do you think it skewed any of the reporting?
I'm sorry?
Embedding reporters in this war. Did it mess up the reporting in your view?
And
listen, all of us had a small window on it all, and I was very skeptical of embedded reporters, of the whole process. To start with, I was wrong. I think it was enormously successful. I mean, I have one sort of theory on this, is that I think it was demeaned inadvertently by the television networks and CNN and whatever, who had all of this airtime that they had to fill. The reporters who had the most to say were in the worst position to say it because they were hurtling in battles and whatever, and they didn't stop for, World News Tonight or Morning Edition or whatever. Those who had the least to say were in the best position to talk endlessly, and they did. And it was because the networks had to fill air. So I know that many embedded correspondents who did superb jobs came back and were really sort of, and found out Americans sort of went, oh, you were an embedded reporter? Oh. And they were shocked in a way that their experience had been dismissed. I think that's beginning to change now, as people are either going to read more material that embedded reporters collected and weren't able necessarily in the rush and the heat of combat, and because many of them really were. in far more dangerous. I mean, Eric Westerfeld, for instance, for NPR, was in far more dangerous circumstances than I was.
Jack Lawrence, who wrote the book The Cat from Way, about his experience in Vietnam, I think, was embedded throughout the entire time with the Third, and has
so,
yet to write anything about it, but is putting it in a book form. And I think that what he has to say about that time will teach us a lot that we don't know about the war. I think you're right. Sir.
I'm hoping you can talk about what it was like to work with those people that were your eyes and ears when you couldn't get out. I've done research in Tibet in fairly tense situations, and if you can talk about how you negotiate, did you talk about the dangers that he might be putting himself in, or that these other people who were out sort of observing, did you feel like they were being watched by the authorities? Did they? You
mean, for instance, my driver who was helping me?
I haven't read the book, but maybe you talk about this. But does he say, I'm willing to take a certain risk?
Yeah, he knew. I mean, he knew what risks he was taking, and he was very careful. And we had discussed it. And there were some things, as I say, earlier, he wouldn't do. He'd just say it's too damn dangerous. I can't do it.
For him or for you or both? So would he say to you, no, you can't go there? Or would he say, no, I'm not going there?
Both. He was no fool. In fact, he read the book, though, and he said, you went there. I told you not to go there.
But I like the first part of the question, which is how do you establish a working relationship with someone like that? Because Omar is a school teacher when you meet him, but he's not a school teacher by the time you get to know him very well.
He was my driver to start with. Somebody through somebody, and so, and had he not been very good or very useful, I would have kept my ears open for somebody else who could have been. I was lucky in that case that literally from the first day I was in Baghdad, I was given this present. But wherever you go as a foreign correspondent, you need someone like that. Whether it's Kosovo or Bosnia or Sierra Leone or wherever it is, even if you speak the language, you need someone who understands the society and who's open. The requirements are very, demanding in a way. They need to be open. They need to be willing to sort of take each experience as it comes and not get politically in a fight, while you're trying to do an interview with somebody. They need to be brave, but not so brave that they can, going to get you killed. In my case, they need to have a sense of direction because I can't get myself from A to B. And you find those people, we all do. Dick, you know as well as anybody, you find those people, and the only problem is you hit the ground and you've got to find them fast. You can't sort of put out an ad sort of saying, following requirements. And it's amazing how often they just kind of rise to the surface, and also then other reporters will help, or somebody's already there on the ground, and, Abdullah will know Ali, who will know so-and-so, and so once the first person is there, the chain begins to form to good people. But they're critical. It's every foreign correspondent's secret weapon.
And it's fascinating, too, when you look back. When I was, where was I? I was based in Moscow and working in Afghanistan, and hired a translator by the name of Salahuddin and a driver by the name of Amir Shah, and was able to find out after the fall of the Taliban that Salahuddin is now filing for the BBC from Kabul, and Amir Shah is the AP bureau chief, right? I didn't teach these guys anything, they were just, they happened to be around when I was looking for someone in '93. But what they do, and I'd like to hear Ann talk a little bit about it, is that they understand some of the principles of what we call journalism and storytelling by hanging around with someone like Ann. And that she's not really interested in going off and taking photographs of military installations in Baghdad, but she really means it when she says, can we just go and find a family, somebody who's not unusual, but someone who's representative of life here, and talk to them for a while. And then the fixer and the driver come along and they listen, and it's in their listening to what the reporter's working on that the rapport is built, no?
Absolutely. I mean, and the learning curve with these people, because they care. Usually these are societies in crisis, and they care desperately, and they get it immediately. And just to follow on, my translator from Kosovo has just been asked to be the spokesperson for the new president of the country. I mean, these people are extraordinary. I mean, when they're good, they're invaluable and brave. Wading through, we asked them to do. I mean, we're with them, but we're asking, these people to do extraordinary things and to find us. I mean, you say to them, okay, I want to meet, a military officer who was betrayed by, I can imagine, is this? Do you know anybody who might know? I mean, they're extraordinary.
Thanks for your question. We've got time for one more. I'm sorry, but
no, that's okay.
And time's tight, so go ahead. Go ahead, pull that mic down there so we can hear you. There you go.
Okay. How do the Iraqis feel about the UN presence in Iraq? Do they see it as the United Nations, or do they see it as a front for the U.S.? And how did they feel about the bombing of the UN facilities?
Iraqis sort of see the UN in two ways. One as having been the punishing force that of the sanctions. On the other hand, many of them have also had very good relations with the UN and received help through them. They were most Iraqis were appalled and at the bombing. There was no applause from anyone I talked to. They were horrified. They're horrified by all of these bombings because they're just as they're unseen enemies to the American troops. They are to the Iraqis too, and in fact, it was mainly Iraqis who suffered in the bombing of the UN.
Well, I could pour a glass of medicine and sit and talk for another 2 hours, but you're going to go through that door to the bookstore to meet people and sign some books there, and I want to ask people here to join me in thanking not just Vin and Annie, but Amr, the driver, as well.
But I have a question for Dick Gordon. When are you coming to Baghdad next, Dick?
I don't know. November.
I'm going in. You want to go?
November.
December?
Well, it depends on whether or not I'm allowed out, I'm planning now early November. That's my next plan. So we'll see you there sometime. Thank you very much.